Alrighty, so in this short lecture, we are going to talk about social theory. What is it? Additionally, we are going to talk about this broad academic discipline that we, your instructors, kind of fall under called the human dimensions of natural resource management. And then we're also going to go through some just really short applied examples of how theory can be used in natural resource management. As always, let me, Michael, or Chanel know if you have any questions, both about the content of the class, but also if you have any questions about um, assignments or quizzes or the structure of the class or whatever else. We're always happy to chat. Okay, so I really want you all to do this at-home reflection activity. And it might feel kind of weird, but in one sentence, I want you to individually write a definition of theory on a sheet of paper or a device. If you can't articulate a clear definition, think about its purpose, the purpose of theory, or even how it's discussed kind of more broadly in society. And I really do want you to do this. Again, it might feel weird. We don't have a lot of these pause the lecture, do a activity type thing. But I really do encourage you to pause right now and write this sentence. Okay, so now that you have thought about what theory is and how, you've written it down, or at least you've sat back and thought okay, this is kind of what I think theory is. I'm going to give you a really, really broad definition of what it is, and this is something that we are going to build on throughout the entire semester. But this is kind of like the foundational, really simple kind of general definition of theory. So all theory is this systematic explanation of observed events. So the explanation is going to take a written or visual form. So you're going to write out what you think is happening with an observed event. Or you are going to use a figure or a framework, a conceptual framework that had a flow chart, I suppose you can think of it that way. And you can have a box of, I think this thing is contributing to let's say people recycling, or someone's belief about whether or not they think recycling is effective or whatever else. That leads into the behavior of recycling. That's just an example, right? And that's just one kind of variable within that example, right? So all theory it's just this systematic explanation of observed, observable events. And we're gonna really kind of break this down quite a bit more, but on its fundamental level, we're just kind of explaining empirical phenomena. What you're doing, and I kind of referred to this just a second ago, but we're really specifying suspected relationships among concepts. A variable is how you measure concepts or constructs, but we're interested in how X relates to Z. And in social theory, we're interested in how often, how our attitudes, our values, our beliefs, social norms, that kind of stuff leads to or doesn't lead to specific types of behavior. And within this class, especially within this class, this is a policy, law, and human behavior class. We're really, really interested in how on-the-ground workers, how people who kind of engage with or have to work with policies on a day-to-day basis, how they understand those policies, and how ultimately things like their personal values, their attitudes, the social norms of where they work, the types of resources they have at their disposal, all these different kinds of variables or concepts, how those contribute to the behavior that they ultimately engage in terms of policy implementation. That's not the only thing we talk about in this class, but that's a really core component of it. And ultimately, right, after we have come up with a systematic explanation of empirical or observable events and specified relationships among different concepts, ultimately what theory attempts to do is to describe, explain, and for some, predict social phenomena. Again, within this class, we're interested in how people kind of interrogate, engage with policies, and how these different concepts and beliefs, attitudes, norms kind of manifest into actual observable policy implementation kind of on the ground. And again, I kind of think that right now this is a little bit abstract, but I hope by the end of this lecture we're going to have a decent idea of what this means in the real world. And definitely, by half of the first semester of class, we're going to really know what theory is, how to use it, how to measure different concepts and that kind of stuff. So that's what theory defines. I bet it was probably similar to the definition you wrote down. Maybe not the exact words, right? But I think we all kind of have an intuition about what theory is. And what you had was probably in the ballpark of what we've got here as we've defined it. So I mentioned in the beginning that I was going to talk really broadly about this academic discipline referred to as the human dimensions of natural resources. The human dimensions of natural resource management is another way to describe it. And this is kind of what I fall under. I don't know if Mike or Chanel would agree with me, but their work, I think, falls under this broad category of the human dimensions of natural resources. Essentially, it is about understanding humans, because humans play a role in managing natural resources, and they affect natural resources, they affect ecosystems, and in order to really understand these things in an effective way, in ethical ways, we need to understand the human element of these socio-ecological, technological systems. So, like theory, human dimensions of natural resources, really not everybody in this field, but a lot of us are really trying to describe, predict, and understand human thought and action towards natural resources, right? So that's a big aspect of it, and that's useful because if we can understand it, we can manipulate it, we can write better policy, we can manage these resources or steward these resources in a more efficient or ethical way. We're interested in how people value resources, how they want them managed, and how people are affected and affect resources by policy, legal aspects, and also regulatory decisions, right? So essentially, we're interested in how this kind of speaks to the policy implementation piece, but also like more of a public stakeholder piece as well. But how these natural resources are essentially affected by people and the manifestations of human culture and thought, which includes, legal, like policy, even political frameworks and regulatory decisions too. We're interested in human behavior and its effects on resources, some of the forces behind these decisions, and strategies to address human behaviors on resources too. Again, this kind of speaks to what we've talked about earlier in this lecture, but again, we're interested in a really simple way in the role of humans, human behavior in natural resources, in ecosystems. This is going to become kind of increasingly obvious throughout the class, but even in a wilderness ecosystem, which is something that I have studied, and I've been a wilderness ranger, and I've worked and done research in those areas. Those areas are highly impacted by humans, and they're highly managed by humans, even though they're called federally designated wilderness areas. And in addition, right, we're going to be talking about urban ecosystems. We're going to be talking about lawns, right? And those obviously are impacted by humans and human behavior, human values. But in both of these situations, from the extreme of wilderness to the extreme of the lawn, nature and the material world is also kind of exerting its own agency, perhaps, on human behavior and whatnot. So that's what some folks are interested now too, is the relationship between human behavior, values, whatnot, but also taking seriously the non-human world and the limits, I suppose, that it puts on human behavior and human agency. So we'll dig into that, I think, a little bit throughout the term. Really, the purpose of natural resource management is not the purpose of it, but rather like the word management implies that people and humans are integral to it, right? Humans manage things, we measure things, we try to understand things, and essentially the human dimensions of natural resources really brings people into that realm. And to take a step back, I suppose I was an ESPM major, back, I don't know, 15-ish years ago, and I remember while I was in my major, I came to this realization that, oh shoot, like we need to understand humans in addition to understanding ecosystems and hydrology and silviculture and all these different things, that in order to really like manage these systems ethically and efficiently, like we need to understand people. So while I was an ESPM major, I added on anthropology as a dual degree or a second major. I don't know if that was the best idea in the world, but certainly this is stuff that I hope you're already kind of thinking about. Okay, so really briefly, I'm going to talk about the many applied uses of theory, just in some really big, broad examples right now. Okay, so one use of theory could be, understanding the relationship between attitudes and how people behave towards urban coyotes, right? So, do they tolerate them? Like, do they think they are good or bad? And what's the relationship between their perceptions or their attitudes of them and whether or not they're tolerated? And what role can natural resource managers play in managing those populations or taking a hands-off approach or kind of a more hands-off approach? And that could be driven by the public, right? And public perceptions, public desires, public attitudes. So that's just one example. Tolerance of beaver impacts could be another example too, right? Kind of same idea, right? Like how tolerant is the public? Right now, I'm talking about the public as like this monolithic thing. The public is diverse, right? The public is not this kind of monolithic thing that they all have the same values or anything like that. But just a broad understanding, like what communities perhaps are more tolerant of beaver impacts than other communities, and can we, as managers, either do education of the communities that are more or less tolerant of them, or maybe more importantly, how can we as managers, learn from those communities and learn about their values and their attitudes and what role those play in tolerance, right? And really take those publics seriously, because ultimately, as natural resource managers, we're taxpayer funded. We have science as our guide, like biophysical science as our guide, but also like our own values play a role in management, but also public values, the diverse public values play a role in our management of these resources too. We could also be interested in interpersonal social values and conflict among different groups in parks and protected areas, right? So, there's horseback riders here. They've got conflicts often with mountain bikers. We got somebody on a sup. Looks like he's going over a surfer. I definitely know that there are conflicts between surfers and stand-up paddleboarders. Cross-country skiers with mountain bikers or fat tire bicyclists, but also cross-country skiers with snowmobiles and snowmobiles with cross-country skiers, etc. We can understand by using social science what kind of drives these different values and what maybe will drive some of these conflicts, and then by understanding when conflict will arise, we can organize trail systems perhaps a little bit better, and only allow horseback riders and hikers on a trail and not allow mountain bikers on a trail, for instance, because we know that horseback riders and mountain bikers have some conflict, right? So that's just kind of one example. Also, just in general, public attitudes towards recreation, tourism, and management in protected areas, right? It's really important to understand these public attitudes to kind of like what I was talking about in the previous slide, but really in some ways, not always necessarily, reflect the management of these resources in ways that are resonant with the public. Again, public, capital P, isn't this monolithic group, right? There are many diverse publics that are going to have different values, different attitudes for how these resources are managed, right? And we should take all of those seriously because they're all stakeholders in public lands, for instance. And just as a side note, this is Saguaro National Park outside of Tucson. This here is the Three Sisters Wilderness in Oregon. This is, I think, the Chrissy Promenade in San Francisco. It's part of Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And these little rhyolitic volcanic columns, this is Chiricahua National Monument. And these are all places that I've worked. So part of these first lectures, I'm just going to kind of introduce you to some of my background, I suppose. But these are all really cool places. If you're interested in public lands and that kind of stuff, talk to me after class or over Zoom or whatever else. I'm completely happy to talk about careers in this field. Also, really importantly too, it's especially in the West, but I think probably increasingly in other parts of the country, understanding societal response to wildfire is really important. I guess one example of this could be that prescribed burning is really important, and we want to understand people's perception of prescribed burning, of maybe smoke, like wildfire smoke from prescribed burning, um, and how to communicate with the public, how to best communicate with the public when prescribed burning or other kind of forest management is happening. And it's really important, again, especially in the West. Wildfire is something that causes ecological impacts for sure. And fire is a natural part of ecosystems, but in many of these areas that have been not burned for decades and not managed in the way that they were managed by indigenous people for a very, very, very long time. It's led up to these buildups of how some people are thinking of like unnatural wildfire events, coupled with climate change and drought and everything too. So understanding societal response to wildfire and how we can maybe work with the public to do better or more prescribed burning could be an example of how to use theory and how to really integrate the human perspective there. We want to understand the effects of things like environmental messaging. Believe it or not, the way, we'll get into this later in the class, the semester, but the way that all of these things are framed and all of these messages are framed are more or less effective, right? So I won't get into this too much, but this appealing thing, and then there's a banana on compost. That pink appealing thing will capture people's attention. It's short and it's concise, which means that people will probably actually read this sign, right? There are like theoretical reasons why this is the case, and social psychological reasons that kind of help explain why that's the case. And we use something called communication theory to kind of to figure out what works for these kinds of signage and environmental messaging. And these percentages here, this speaks to something called descriptive norms, right? Mike is going to talk about this later on in the class. Descriptive norms are, in a message, you say that a lot of people are doing this behavior. And if a person reads this sign and they think that, 90% of people think that recycling is kind of important, that might make you think that it's important as well for various reasons. There are other kind of strategies in signage and communication. With this hotel sign, it says something like, "You make the difference." A towel hanging up means "I will use again." A towel on the floor means "Please exchange." That's like a clear kind of guidance here. Thank you for helping us conserve the Earth's vital resources. That speaks, I think, to something called an injunctive norm. What's right or wrong. So all of that too is informed by theory, and we'll get into that a little bit later on in the class. But again, understanding theory and how it works can help us frame messages on signs in our writing and our speaking in more effective ways. It also helps us understand these macro level, big level social things like mining or logging at the large scale. It can help us promote more sustainable practices in forestry, right? Like theory is something that with natural resource management, anything where humans are involved, social theory is something that's going to be really, really helpful as we're understanding it and trying to change things too, if that's something that you're interested in. Okay, so importance of theory. I hope by the end of this, we've kind of understood that theory, even though it sounds like an academic thing, it's more than just like an academic exercise, and it's really the cornerstone of explanation, prediction, and ultimately just understanding phenomena. This is important in natural resource management. Humans play a role in managing natural resources, hence the word management or managing. Theory provides a medium or a foundation for studies. So this is like peer-reviewed work, research, to build on each other into this greater whole that leads to knowledge, right? So I didn't get too much into this, but theory in and of itself, one study can test a theory, another study can test the same theory and figure out if it's applicable in a different context. If it's not applicable in that context, the authors then might explain why and what's a better kind of way to explain something in a different context. So theory really builds on itself, and people researchers kind of as craftspeople, right? Like researchers are craftspeople as well. We make things. We use the abstract world in some ways to make these things, but we're makers, right? We make stuff, and what we kind of are doing is making knowledge through these kind of research studies. So I hope that was helpful. Let us know again if you have any questions about what social theory is. We're really happy to talk about it. And the next lecture, we're going to break down what the parts of theory are now that we kind of have a foundational understanding about what theory as a whole is. So thank you.